Five, four, three, two, one.
All right. Hello, willkommen, bienvenue, konnichiwa, ni hao, jambo, marhaba. It's time for the Armist Inquisition yet again, episode 239 on Sunday, the 10th of July, 2022. I'm Amish Phil.
I'm Amish Matt.
And tonight we have a returning champion, a renegade Egyptologist, author, lecturer, ancient historian. I nearly said ancient scholar then. Ancient historian and scholar, David Rohl. How you doing, David?
I'm fine, guys. Nice to see you again.
Thanks so much.
The ancient historian sounds like I'm the age I'm at. Be careful what you say that. Scholar of ancient history is a proper way to say it.
That's better, yeah. I do get my words backwards from time to time. It's been known.
So do I. Don't worry about it.
Thanks for giving us your time again and coming back and schooling us on all things ancient history. We do value it. We know how busy you are. You've got a million projects going on at the same time. So thanks a lot for coming.
Well, it's fine. I'm actually having a bit of a retirement at the moment. I've given up a few teaching classes, and the summer's here. Very hot, of course. So I'm going to have a couple of months writing, for the next 2 months or so.
Excellent. Yeah, make the most of it, you know.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Swimming pool outside and looking down on the Mediterranean. It's very nice. Could see Ibiza in the distance.
Wow. Oh, cool.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you're up in rainy Lancashire, is that right?
Rainy Lancashire. What's it been, 27 degrees today?
27 degrees, yeah. We can look out across Morecambe Bay and just about see the disused oil rigs
okay.
in the
But
bay.
you get the heat and you still get 20 inches of rain on the same day, don't you?
Exactly, yeah. Has been a little bit like that, yeah, recently, definitely.
Oh, I do miss that part of the world, I have to say. Not that much.
Well, David, you haven't come to talk to us about the weather, have you now?
No, not really.
And in our email, we were talking, you mentioned the subject of the Holy Grail, which is something that has captured the imagination of scholars and archaeologists and theologians for centuries. So it's a fascinating topic, which I'm looking forward to diving into. Now, where I wanted to start, because I think it's kind of foundational, really, before we get into the Holy Grail, is this question of the historicity of Jesus. Was this guy a real dude or not?
Yes, interesting. Okay, that's a very interesting start. Well, one I counter with the idea of asking you what you think the difference is between a myth and a legend, because we have to ask ourselves, is that story mythological or is it legendary? Do you reckon you could give me an answer to that? What do you think of the differences?
No.
It's something I've never thought about, the difference between a myth and a legend. To me, they're like synonymous.
No, they're not. They're very different. You understand them this way, that the myth is the invention of the fertile mind. It's a creation out of your head, as opposed to a legend, which is actually just an elaboration of something that happened in the past, which is then legendized. So
like my legendary meatballs with pasta.
Yeah, that, or Marilyn Monroe's a legend in her own lifetime, right? But she's a real person. Okay. So you could now let's shove that onto Jesus then. Is Jesus something that's a creation, an invention of the mind, or is it actually a person that really existed that's had a legend built up around him? And that's the question you really ought to think about. I reckon Jesus did exist. We know that Tacitus mentioned him. And I think it's absolutely possible that there was a person, whatever his name was, Yeshua or whatever, who lived in the time of Pontius Pilate and in the time of Herod, who was born in the time of Herod, and the stories that have evolved around him. He obviously was a very well-known rabbi in the area, and obviously a brilliant man. If those words that we see in the scriptures, the four gospels, if they are really his words, then he's a person to be admired for sure. Because I would consider him to be one of the great men of history. But people would take an opposite view. So the question is, does it fit into the historical picture? And that's a good starting point, really, because if you're going to talk about the Holy Grail, we have to think about what the Holy Grail actually was. Well, what do you think the Holy Grail was?
Well, there are different. I mean, one of my questions was going to be sort of how relevant the Grail romances are, because they have different views, don't they? Whether it was a chalice or a platter, a stone.
I was reading about today.
Yeah, absolutely.
In more recent times, with the explosion of Dan Brown, we've had the sort of royal blood, the Sangreal theories. So I mean, it seems to be up for debate, really.
Okay, but in I would call traditional historical terms, it has a very solid basis, and it's not so much the Dan Brown Holy Blood, Holy Grail thing, the Magdalene idea. It's about something which we could call a vessel or a cup, or if you want to call it a dish, you can do, which was actually used in the Last Supper. In other words, wherever it was that Jesus and his apostles gathered together for that feast, whoever owned that building, whoever owned the house, would have presented them with his best crockery, basically. So up he brings out a cup which is used in what we would call in the Catholic Church the Eucharist, the actual ritual of the Mass. You know, the blood and the flesh thing that they have in the Christian world. So it's probably a cup. Now, what kind of cup is something else? And we do know there's an additional story that's added on to that Last Supper story, which is that Joseph of Arimathea collected Jesus Christ's blood on the cross. That's the other element of the story. Now, they're not necessarily attached, those two stories. One may be a complete invention independent of the other. But let's start from the basis of Jesus being a rabbi, somebody who came along and started teaching and was very popular, and then was eventually charged with what basically sedition. You know, he was accused by the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, of claiming to be the Messiah, which was like a cardinal sin in those days to do that. And of course, then Pontius Pilate stepped in, or was asked to step in, and the Romans executed him on the cross. And then he was, as we know in the story, he was then buried just before the beginning of what's called Shabbat, Sabbath, which in the Jewish thinking is a weekly thing that happens every Friday evening when the sun goes down, and it lasts all the way through Saturday, and that's their Sabbath. The Christians have moved it to Sunday for some reason, but originally, of course, it was on Saturday. But the questions that arise out of that are, what happened to that cup if it existed at all, and what's the traditional history of it, and can it be backed up by written evidence, documentary evidence? And I think we can show that. And what was its travels? How did it go from Jerusalem to wherever? You know, you've got the Glastonbury legends of George of Arimathea bringing the cup to England, to Britain, and then there's a Roman tradition and also a Spanish tradition. So can we link all those three together is the question, and I think we can, and that's what I hope we can do today.
Wow, that sounds good. Yeah.
Okay.
So I mean, where do we start at the venue of the Last Supper? Because I think I read somewhere, was that maybe Mark's house, or someone related to Mark?
There's different opinions of it. One of the strongest traditional opinions is it's actually Joseph of Arimathea's house, who was apparently the uncle of Jesus. He was the brother of Jesus, Mary, the Virgin Mary's father. So he's like an uncle, but he was also a very high-ranking individual in the Sanhedrin, in the council. So he was quite a powerful man and quite wealthy. And of course, then you have the legends about him being a tin merchant, which come from Britain, of course, and him coming to Cornwall and bringing tin back. Tin being very important, of course, in the ancient world for making bronze. So 10% tin, 90% copper makes bronze. So it was a very valuable commodity, and there wasn't much of it around to actually go and get. So Coleman was one of the main places in this period where they might have gone to collect tin or to get tin. So if that tradition is correct, then actually it's Joseph, his uncle, who has invited him to have his group having a supper there. What the heck was the supper? What was the Last Supper? Well, in the Jewish tradition, it would be the supper before the Sabbath that you have. And more importantly than that, and this is the crucial thing of understanding here, is there are two sorts of Shabbats, two sorts of Sabbaths. One is the high Sabbath, which you probably never heard of, and one is the weekly Sabbath. Now, the weekly Sabbath is the one that kicks off at sunset on Friday and lasts all the way through to sunset on Saturday. But the high Sabbath is something very different. The high Sabbath was actually the Passover Sabbath, which just gets us back to the Exodus and Moses. So it actually occurs in different times of the year in the rotating through, as the weekly Sabbath appears every week. And it just so happens, when you look back into the time when Jesus might have been born and when he was crucified, and that interval of time, there is a particular date where you would have two Sabbaths. And actually in the Gospels, it mentions the fact that there are two Sabbaths involved here, not one. If you look at the Greek text, there's actually there's an S on the end of the word Sabbath or Shabbat. So, so we're actually talking about an occasion where Jesus invites his apostles to come, his disciples and disciples actually, should get it right, his disciples to come and sit and have a supper that is the feast before the Passover, the one that, that happened when Moses told the people to go inside the houses and paint their doorposts with blood, and then the angel of God came along and killed all the firstborn. That's what it's celebrating. Okay, and then that happens, and then there's the weekly Sabbath. So you have the two of them almost one after the other, and that's quite interesting because that's quite rare to actually have that happen. So the question I would put to you, and I hope we can, in this particular session, we can have a sort of to and fro. So I'll ask you questions, and perhaps you can give me some answers. So when do you think Jesus was born?
Now this is something to do with the reign of Herod, isn't it? Because
it is
as far as I know, Herod died before year 1. So I think
well, there are two choices. One is 4 BC,
and the other is 6.
and one is 1 BC. So I mean, there are two possibilities, but the one that most scholars favor is the 4 BC one, and that's mainly because his successor became ruler in 4 BC. So either Herod was still alive when his successor took over and there was like a co-regency, which doesn't sound like Herod to me.
No.
Or he died in 4 BC and his successor started in 4 BC. So that makes sense to me. So if Jesus was born in just before 4 BC, because you know that Herod wanted to kill all the male infants that were up to 2 years old.
Yep.
So you could put Jesus's birth anywhere between 6 BC and 4 BC, really. But let's just argue it was 4 BC for the moment. And then when he gets baptized by John the Baptist, we're told that he's around 30 years old at that point. Okay, so you tack on that 30 years to 4 BC, and you're into what, 20, what would you into? 26? Yeah, 26 BC. Yeah, 26 AD, rather. That's when we talk about the baptism, and that's when he begins his mission, as it were, which lasts about 2 years. So we're talking about a crucifixion in 26 AD. Right. Now, normally when you read Wikipedia, it'll say year 30 or something, 30 AD. But actually 26 BC makes a lot of sense, because it's in that year, when we're looking at April, when the Passover feast was celebrated, that occurs on a Wednesday, just before, 2 days before the Friday weekly Sabbath. And you probably know that a lot of scholars have been arguing about the fact that there aren't 3 days between Good Friday and Easter Sunday when he's resurrected. You know that story, and it's supposed to be 3 days and 3 nights. Well, there aren't 3 days and 3 nights from Friday evening through to Sunday morning. So, but if you realize that what the Last Supper is actually celebrating the Passover feast, okay, then that's on Wednesday. when he's executed, okay, when he's crucified. And then you've got the right amount of time before the resurrection, so to speak, on Sunday. So it would make more sense, in fact, if we had not instead of having Good Friday, we had Good Wednesday. That would be much more sensible. Good Friday is an invention of the Christian world. It's not actually based on anything else. And it looks very much like the crucifixion took place on just before sunset on Wednesday.
Wednesday,
because there is a gap. That's very controversial.
Because there is a gap, isn't there, between the Last Supper and the crucifixion? He's been chased by the Sanhedrin, and it's the Garden of Gethsemane and all that stuff.
It doesn't have to be that long, because the Passover feast, it's that evening that they all go trucking off to the Mount of Olives. And that's where you talk about the Gethsemane incident where he's arrested. So that all happens on the same night as the supper. Okay.
Right, and he's taken to Caiaphas' house, isn't he?
And then there's all the business in the morning of the trial and all the rest of it. And the choose which of the three and all that stuff that Pontius Pilate gets into. And then the cross would be carried to whatever the cross was, would be carried to the place of execution, and he would be dead and about 3 o'clock in the afternoon and buried before sunset. That's the way it looks. And then you've got the 3-day interval before Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb and finds it empty. Now that's all part of the story, or let's call it the legend, all right? But it makes more sense if it's a Wednesday rather than a Friday.
Just going back to the 26 AD, which we reckon is the date of the crucifixion. Yeah. Now, he is baptized by John and then starts his ministry.
No, hang on. Wait a minute. 26th is not the date of the execution. That's the date of the baptism.
Right.
Okay, when he was 30, around 30. So if you take 4 BC to 26, it adds up to 30 years. Okay. And then he's got his mission, which takes about 2 years before the execution or before the crucifixion. So we're talking about 28 AD for the crucifixion.
Right.
And baptism in 26 and 28 is the crucifixion.
Got you. And 28 is that year where the weekly Passover and the special Passover are closely aligned. So that makes sense.
Dead right. Yeah, and so that's about 2 years earlier than most scholars in the past have thought it took place.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's quite surprising. I didn't realise that he was only sort of spreading the word for 2 years. I thought it was longer for some reason. I thought it was like a decade or something.
Oh no. Yeah. It's not that long actually. Interestingly, and there's some debates about how many Passovers there were between his baptism and his execution, but there's a confusion about that. So it looks about right. 2 years looks about right, and you would expect not much longer than that, because quite frankly, the Sanhedrin would have been pretty pissed off with him, and they wouldn't wait around too long. And of course, the crime that he's accused of is coming down the Mount of Olives from Bethany through a place called Bethphage, which is the town on top of the Mount of Olives, and coming down into the Kidron Valley and going into Jerusalem through the Eastern Gate, where the temple is located. That the crime is the fact that his disciples claimed in the Messiah to be the Messiah, the King, on Palm Sunday. That whole story of him coming down on a donkey or a white ass or mule, whatever it was. And so that's one of the crimes. Now, in Roman law, there are two ways where you can be executed. The first is where you commit the crime, which is coming down the Mount of Olives. And the second is where you're arrested. Now, where was Jesus arrested? He was arrested on the Mount of Olives in the Garden of Gethsemane. So the crucifixion would have taken place on the Mount of Olives, not where everybody else thinks it took place, in the middle of Jerusalem on the western side. It would have been on the eastern side of Jerusalem, facing the temple.
Oh, wow. Right.
Wow.
So is
okay, and there's a lot. Sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, is it Golgotha? Is that the place where he was?
Well, yeah, Golgotha is an Aramean word. Right. Calvary, which is the other term for it, it means the head or the cranium. Golgotha has two meanings. It doesn't mean necessarily just the skull. It also means the cranium, the top of the head.
Right. Okay.
If you're watching me. Yeah. So the Mount of Olives is actually a cranium-shaped hill. And in the time of King David, it was referred to as the head.
Right. Okay.
Okay. So it's possible, very likely, in fact, that he was executed on the Mount of Olives not in the so-called Holy Sepulchre or in the Garden Tomb to the north, which a lot of Protestant Christians believe. So it's much more likely that the execution place was there, somewhere on that Mount of Olives.
Right.
But that's got nothing to do with the Holy Grail.
No, but it's still interesting.
It is, isn't
I was
it?
just going
Definitely.
to, ask about the Sanhedrin and Pontius Pilate not having enough troops to quell the potential civil unrest. But we can get mired in this stuff because it's just so interesting. And there's so much to go through. And
You've
like
been
you
watching
said,
too many movies, obviously.
No, yeah, I love Indiana Jones.
Let's stick to the history. But I mean, that basically is that if we talk about the timeline of the story of Jesus, that's what we're looking at. Something like that. Maybe if you want to go back to the year 30 AD, you can, but I prefer 28, to be honest. Now, and that all triggers off what happens with that cup, because that cup, if they're celebrating the Passover feast in the house of Joseph, his uncle, who owns the crockery and all the rest of it, then that cup belongs to Joseph, right? Which explains why the other tradition has Joseph collecting the blood of Christ in the Holy Grail, the cup of Christ. How would he get it if he wasn't the owner of the house?
Yeah, that makes sense. And plus, like you mentioned, his general social standing, his influential, his wealth. Yeah. It makes a lot of sense, that.
And don't forget, Jesus was buried in his tomb, which was unfinished, basically. It was a new tomb. So he's very closely connected to this.
Yes, he petitions. Doesn't he petition Pilate for the custody of the body?
Exactly. And he whips it off the cross within 3 hours, okay, which is unique because most executions on the cross, crucifixions, take a day or two to complete. So that's all very interesting, but we'll not get onto the theology of that because that's a bit dicey. But what I would like to talk about is what happens then with that cup. What happens with it? And to find out that, you have to trace what happened to Joseph Arimathea. What happened to him? So tell me what happened to him. What do you reckon?
I think he probably had to do a runner sharp. Because, he's related to this guy. This guy is an upstart, sparking civil unrest. He's an influential guy of means. He has the means and the wherewithal. He's already been, he'll have this network of traders and boats, and he'll know people all around the Mediterranean. Yeah. And he would probably be in danger. I would feel he would be in danger.
Yeah, he would be in danger. And guess what else? Because he was effectively related to the Holy Family, all the Christians that were there at the time who were about to become persecuted, two of them were executed, one by stoning, the other, I don't know how he was killed. But they have to clear out. The Christians have to clear out. So who do they go to get a ship to get away from Caesarea? Well, they go to the uncle. Yeah. Joseph, who's got ships, because he's a tin merchant and he's a trader. Okay, so they go on a ship with him west, out of Israel, out of Judea, and they head for southern France. And that's why when you read the traditional history of France, you have a patron saint of France. Do you know who that is?
No.
Mary Magdalene.
Right.
Okay, now Mary Magdalene was very closely associated with Jesus, whether she be his girlfriend, his wife, or just a disciple, is difficult to say, but she was a very important character. She was the one who was going to the tomb to anoint the body, to clean the body down. So she had a very close relationship with Jesus, obviously. And some people have argued that she was actually his wife. And I wouldn't disagree with that. In fact, it's a tradition in the Jewish faith for rabbis to be married, and Jesus was a rabbi. There's no reason why he shouldn't have had a wife.
No, that's a later addition, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I know, but it's just a thing about Mary Magdalene has always been put down by the patriarchal Christian church.
Yeah, exactly.
The woman, the failed woman, the prostitute, the fallen woman.
Do you think there's any? Sorry to interrupt, Dave. Do you think there's any truth that she may have been a woman of means as well? Because there's stories about the oil that she uses to anoint his feet and whatever, it's like frankincense and myrrh, like super dear stuff.
Well, she's Mary of Magdala, and Magdala is a place upon the Sea of Galilee, just north of Tiberias, and the synagogue there's just been found recently, actually. So she will have been a wealthy woman, and she probably financed much of Jesus's mission. We're not actually told where the funds came from for the mission and to look after the disciples, etc. But it seems to me that the women were behind that, the wealthy women who supported him. So I think that Mary Magdalene was a key to that. Yeah, absolutely. So when you get to France, and then there's a whole story there that is a traditional story. But if you go to what's it called now, the big church on a hill in Paris, I can never remember its name. What's it called? What was it, Danny? No, not Sambaum. My wife's telling me something that's wrong. Hang on a minute. It is. I'm trying to find the picture. I told you I'm going to need notes today because it's all far too complicated. So I'm just trying to find something. Hold on a minute. I'm trying to see if I can find the name of it. Hold your horses. Talk amongst yourselves while I find this picture. Oh, there we go. Yeah, Le Sacré-Cœur. Have you heard of that? It's that beautiful white church on a hill in Paris, right? It's a fabulous, fabulous church. Well, when you go inside that church, which is one of the great churches of France, and you look up above the altar, there's an apse, and there's a fantastic mosaic up there, beautiful mosaic. And part of the mosaic shows a boat coming into a place called Saintes-Maries-de-la-Mer, which is near Marseille. It's a little village in the area where the marshes are in southern France. So they arrived.
Saint Mary by the sea.
Yeah.
Yes, actually two Marys, Saintes-Maries-de-la-Mer,
called mother and wife
of the sea. Yeah, no, two Marys, and the boat that you see on the ceiling in that church has Lazarus at the front, Mary Magdalene, and Martha, and a load of other people. Okay, and this is the traditional history of France, that these people arrived near Marseille, at Saint-Marie-de-la-Mer, and there Mary Magdalene established herself in Provence, and she became the great patron saint of France. And she lived in a cave at Saint-Baume for about another 30 years, where she preached, and she was looked after by the local population that she converted. And then she was eventually died, and she was buried in a church called Saint-Maximin de Saint-Baume, where you can still see her skull today in the crypt. It's actually covered in gold, but the skull itself is very visible, and it's been analyzed, and it's actually the DNA and the date, the radiocarbon date for it is 1st century AD.
Wow.
So it fits exactly with Mary Magdalene. It's the right age and everything.
Yeah.
So maybe there's some reality in that story. So this boat, which belonged to Judge Arimathea, because actually there's a guy called Archbishop Rabanus Maurus, who actually says who was in the boat, and he says Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, all from Bethany. So we have one Mary there, right? Then you have Mary Magdalene, the second Mary, and then you have Maxime, who was the one who had the church Saint-Maxime de Saint-Baume, where Mary was buried, and Joseph of Arimathea, along with a whole bunch of other Christians. So it's Joseph's boat, it appears, and he's brought all these refugees from Judea, and they've landed in southern France near Provence. And that's where Mary Magdalene stays. But that's not the end of the story as far as Joseph's concerned, because then, of course, the tradition is that he goes to Britain. He goes back to Cornwall. He goes back to Glastonbury, and he turns up there. So you have, first of all, you have Mary Magdalene establishing herself in Provence, and you have other disciples going off to different parts of the world, to India, to Egypt, etc. Yeah. But it was the job of Joseph Arimathea, who had already made contact with the British, to go and convert the Britons. And so he builds a wattle and daub chapel at Glastonbury, and from there he converts the what we would call the pagans of Britain, as it were, but who mainly through the nobility and the royalty, because the tradition is that he converted the King of Britain. who at that time was called Bran. Have you ever heard of Bran?
Yep.
You have. He's called Bran the Blessed. Bran the Blessed. Okay. And why he's called Bran the Blessed? Because he was one of the first Christians in Britain, converted by Joseph. So Joseph must have come, as the tradition says, he must have come with the Holy Grail, with the cup of Christ from the Last Supper. Okay. And that gives him the authority, because it was used in the Eucharist, to be a preacher, to be a priest, to be a converter of pagans into Christianity. It was his authority. So you've got this situation now where we've moved from Judea, Caesarea, to southern France, where Mary Magdalene hops off and a few others do, and then on round to Britain. And Lazarus apparently also came with Joseph, so he's also there. So we've moved already now to the far reaches of the known world at that time. Yeah. And in fact, the dates now are remarkable, because this is happening only a few years after the crucifixion. So the implications of that are pretty amazing, really, because it means that Britain was one of the first places to be converted to Christianity.
Yeah. Were there any kids on that boat?
Kids? Well, there was one. I think she was called, is it Martha? Not Martha. There's one who is purportedly either as a servant of Mary Magdalene from Africa, or actually a daughter of Mary Magdalene. So then we get into that whole thing about the Holy Blood and Holy Grail thing, where, the descendants of the daughter of Mary Magdalene and Jesus begin a line of kings, and also this priory de Zion thing that went round forever. Yeah. Which I'd rather not get involved in, really, if we can help it, because it's all a bit fictional.
Yeah, it's not secure, put it that way.
No, so it's possible that it was a daughter of Mary Magdalene in the boat, but it's not necessary for the story of the Holy Grail. If the Holy Grail is a cup, that physical object doesn't stay with Mary Magdalene; it goes off to Britain, according to our traditions, our British traditions. So we're all in legend still, aren't we? We're still in legend. We're not into history yet. We've got a sort of rough idea of a historical scenario, but we're really dealing with legend at the moment. We're not dealing with written history. We've got lots of people writing about it, and there's one very interesting one that you might be interested in, if I can just find it again, and that is Gildas. Have you heard of Gildas?
Yeah, he was one of the early Christians in the UK.
Well, he's a British monk. Yeah. And he's really Britain's first historian,
right?
Because St. Bede actually quotes from him. So he's the earliest we get to this story of the Holy Grail coming to Britain, and he actually writes something which is really interesting in AD 542. So we're in the 500s. And he says this, he says, the light of Christ shone in Britain in the last year of the Emperor Tiberius.
Wow.
Okay, so he's actually saying that Christianity came to Britain in the last year of Emperor Tiberius. Now, Tiberius died in AD 37. Okay, so if Jesus was crucified in AD 28, we've only got a few years before these Christian refugees have arrived in southern France and also in Britain in AD 37. Now, I would trust Gildas on this, because he's really early. He's the earliest, the earliest historian in Britain. I think that's a pretty reliable piece of information. And that begins to start to be history now, because we've got a written documentation here. Although it's looking back a few centuries, it's still quite close to the events of the time.
Yeah.
So here we are in the reign of Tiberius, at the end of the reign of Tiberius. Joseph of Arimathea turns up in Britain, and we're talking about AD 37, and this leads us to what happens next, because then we're looking to the era of Claudius coming up soon after Caligula, and Claudius is the guy who conquers Britain.
Yeah.
Okay, so although he doesn't personally take much involvement in it, it's Aulus Plautius, the general, who does all the work. But it actually is in that time, because Julius Caesar failed to conquer Britain, but Claudius did as part of his great triumph. And so that happens in 43 AD, so only a few years later. Okay, so what happens, we think, and we have it in Welsh tradition, Welsh legend, and also in British legend, that George of Arimathea converts Bran, the Blessed, and all his family, and his son-in-law, Bran's son-in-law, is Caradoc. Do you know who Caradoc is?
No, I don't know that name.
Do you know? Have you heard of Caractacus?
Yes, Caractacus. Yes.
Yes. Well, Caradoc is his proper name. Caractacus is the Roman name for him, the Latin name for him. The Greek name was Caratacus, okay, without the C. And so we're talking about the conversion of the British royal family, and Caratacus, or Caradoc, was the great high Pendragon of Britain at the time that Aulus Plautius brought the armies to Britain and invaded Britain. So they were fighting against Caradoc. Okay, now Caradoc was the son-in-law of Bran, and George of Arimathea, when he died, had passed the chalice, the cup, to Bran and the royal family. And it was then passed to Caradoc after Bran, and Caradoc gave it to his son, Lyn. Okay, now Lyn was his eldest son, and he was probably in about 18 or 19 years old at the time, because Caradoc was fighting the Romans, and so his son had to take care of the important cup, the cup of Christ. So we're moving now through what we would call the Grail keepers, right, starting with Joseph, going on to Bran, the Blessed. By the way, the word Bran means raven, and his head is supposedly buried under the mound of the Tower of London, which is why the ravens there, the tradition of the ravens must never leave, because once the ravens leave the Tower of London, Britain will fall. You know that tradition?
Yeah, they just left, I think.
Did they? No, that was the Prime Minister. Don't worry about the rest of it. So all these things are interlinked, you see. The ravens in the Tower of London, that mound that the Tower of London is built on, the tradition is that Bran's head is buried underneath that mound.
Can I ask you a quick sort of contextual question? Yeah. Would Britain at this time have been like a unified kingdom with a power base in London, or would it have been more tribal and southwest, southeast?
Yeah, very much so. Let's pull up a map. Okay, so you have in the southeast, you have the Canti. Guess what? Canterbury is named after them. Right. Okay. You have the Catuvelauni Verulamium, or Verulam, which was the capital of the tribe that Caratacus, or Caradoc, was the ruler of, the Pendragon.
Right.
You have the Iceni up in the northeast of Boudica, and you have the Brigantes in Yorkshire up in the north, and you have the Siluris in South Wales. So there's lots of different tribes, but they did accept a high king who they called the Pendragon. Right. And he was elected amongst all these other kings of these different regions. So at this time, when the invasion took place, the high king, the Pendragon, was Caradoc. And Caradoc is the Roman Caratacus. Now, what happened to him? Well, he fought and fought and fought for about 7 or 8 years, until eventually he was defeated at Caer Caradoc, which is sort of east of Wales slightly. And he then fled north. Now, his wife, the queen, and his daughter and the rest of the family were captured at that battle. And so the only one to escape was Caradoc. And he went up to the Brigantes, where Catimandua was the queen. And she welcomed him, and then she informed the Romans and sold him to the Romans. And so he ended up being captured and put in chains and taken to Rome, along with the rest of his family. So now the family of the Grail keepers, the royal bloodline that was carrying this cup, had now been transported to Rome. So the cup had gone from Jerusalem to Caesarea, to southern France, to Britain, and from Britain now, a few years later in 50 AD, it's turning up now in Rome. it's holding it secretly. That, you know, when the family comes there, the Romans don't know about it. They don't have a clue about this. It's well, you know, before any Christians arrive in Rome. So guess what? Now we've got a situation where the British Christians are the first Christians in Rome, which is amazing. Okay, so you've got a family, a royal family. Now what happens is that Caradoc, who Tacitus now calls Caraticus or Caractacus, is taken in front of the forum and is about to be garroted, as is the you know, the fate of all people who fight against Rome, all the kings who fight against Rome. But he's been educated, able to speak Latin, because his father and Sibyllin and various other people of that time were always taken to Rome for education. So Caradocus could speak Latin. So he asks to be able to give a final speech to the emperor Claudius and the Senate, and it's very famous. You can read it in Tacitus. This famous speech. You want me to read it to you very quickly?
Yeah.
Let me find it. I've just got an abbreviated version in Lancastrian. Okay, so
that's good.
It's not quite in the high-flown Latin, but okay. It says, this is what he says in front of Claudius. He says, "If you Romans choose to lord it over the world, does it follow that the world must accept slavery? If I had surrendered immediately, neither my fall nor your triumph would have become famous. My punishment would have been followed by oblivion. Whereas if you now save my life, I shall be an everlasting memorial to Roman clemency." So he's really appealing to Caligula now. And of course, Caligula swallows it hook, line, and sinker and doesn't have him executed. So now we're in a situation where, what does he do with the royal family from Britain? Well, believe it or not, he actually gives them a palace in Rome, which is called Palatium Britannicum, the British Palace. And that is where Caratacus is exiled. He's not allowed to return to Britain for 7 years. And so his family now live there. So the family is a daughter called Gladys. Gladys, incidentally, in Celtic means princess. Okay. And there's lots of Gladyses in this period, but this is Gladys, okay. And his son, Lyn. Okay, now Lyn gets given a Latin name, Linus. Yeah. Okay. Now Gladys is such a brilliant young girl. She's probably about 17 years old, something like that. She gets adopted by Claudius, the emperor, and given the name Claudia. And she's called Claudia Peregrina, Claudia the foreigner. Right? And she is therefore protected by the emperor. So she actually doesn't get martyred in the end because she's too powerful, because she's the daughter of the Emperor Claudius. So she lives out her life, whereas all the other Brits get executed, various ones at different time, along with the other apostles. So we have Lyn, who's the son of Caratacus, who has the cup of Christ, which has been handed down through the royal bloodline from Joseph Arimathea through to Bran, through to Caratacus, Caradoc, and down to Lyn. So now Paul turns up in Rome. Don't forget, this is about 50 AD. So now Paul turns up in Rome a few years later, about 56 AD, we think. In fact, I think it's Jerome who tells us that he turns up in the 2nd year of Nero.
Right.
So we have a specific date. We know when Nero ruled.
Firm date, yeah.
It's 56 AD, okay, I think. And so Paul turns up. Where does he go to live? He goes and lives with the British in the palace because he actually writes to them beforehand. There's where is that text? Let me see if I can find that one. Excuse me.
Would this be letters to the Romans?
Yes, probably. I think it is. And of course, beforehand, he's writing to Timothy. Sorry, after he gets there. No, is that right? Yes, after he gets there, he writes to Timothy over in Ephesus, and he says, "Greetings from all these people," right? And the people he mentions are this Christian family living in Palatium Britannicum, including Claudia and Pudens, who is the husband of Claudia. She marries a Roman centurion called Pudens, okay, who becomes later on Saint Pudens. He's a martyr. Right. And of course, he mentions Linus as well. So they're all there. And so he comes to live with them in Rome. And they've got this palace, which still exists today, believe it or not. It's actually, I mean, I've been to see it. You know where the Colosseum is, don't you?
Yeah.
In Rome.
Yep.
Well, if you go sort of northish from there, you get to the Viminal Hill. And there is a church, at the oldest church in Rome, oldest basilica. And it's called the Basilica Sancta Pudenziana. And Sancta Pudenziana was the daughter of Pudens. Okay, so Saint Pudenziana is a girl, young girl, another martyr. And there's a Latin inscription on this church, which is actually an old Roman palace villa, which is actually down below the street level today. You have to go down a whole load of steps to get to it. And on the wall of this place, there's a Latin inscription from the 2nd century AD, and this is what it says. It says, "In this sacred and most ancient of churches, formerly the house of Senator Sanctus Pudens." So this is the guy that married Gladys, who is also called Claudia. "And the home of the holy apostles." Holy apostles are Peter and Paul. Mm. Okay, repose the remains of 3,000 blessed martyrs, which Pudenziana and Praxedes, 2 sisters, the virgins of Christ, the daughters of Pudens and I've lost her name, Claudia, interred with their own hands. So there's a cemetery there of 3,000 Christians being buried there. Okay, around this place, because it's the first church in Rome, first Christian church in Rome, and it's the place where the apostles Paul and Peter came when they came to Rome. And Caesar Baronius in Annals Ecclesias, it's a bit later, it's 1588, so it's quite a lot later. He says this: "It is delivered to us by the firm tradition of our forefathers that the house of Pudens, the husband of Claudia, was the first that entertained St. Peter in Rome, where the Christian congregation formed the church, and that of all the churches, the oldest is that which is called after the name of Pudens, so Sancta Pudenziana." So we're starting to get now a legend that's substantiated by a lot of texts, a lot of information. So it's started to be less of a legend and more of a history now. Are you getting the picture?
Yeah, because we're getting sort of non-Christian written sources plus actual physical sites.
Yes, and you've got inscriptions on walls of this building, okay, which is amazing. And it is located in exactly where you would expect the Palatium Britannicum to be located. So now the consequences of all this are fundamentally astonishing, because it means that the first Christians in Rome were British, and they were the royal family. Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting, because when Paul arrives there and stays for a couple of years, he then makes Linus, the son of Caraticus, the first bishop of Rome.
Yeah. People think it's Peter, but it wasn't. Yeah.
No, not Peter. It's Linus.
Yeah.
And we actually have texts from the Vatican archive, mentioning the fact that Linus was the first bishop of Rome, anointed by Paul, and that he was the son of a British king.
Yeah.
Pause for shock and horror.
Well, yeah, because, look at this, throws into question apostolic succession and what the church is built on, St. Peter's throne.
Exactly. And we're all Brits, so it's all very nice for us to say all this. But
absolutely,
it's supported by a lot of interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've come to the sort of end of the first chapter, basically, which is that the cup has come from Jerusalem to Caesarea on a ship to southern France near Marseille, and then it's taken by Joseph to Glastonbury. He then converts the British king and the family, who then became the Grail keepers, the Cup of Christ keepers, until the time of Caradoc, when he's defeated by the Romans, taken in chains to Rome, and his son, who holds the Cup of Christ in his hand, becomes the first bishop of Rome. That's why he becomes the first bishop of Rome, because he can perform the Mass, the Eucharist, with the very cup that Jesus used in the Last Supper. It gives him the authority to be the bishop of Rome.
Yeah, it makes complete sense.
Mm-hmm. So that's really part one. Okay, and part two is probably even more interesting. I don't know, you may not think so, but I think so, because I live in Spain. So we jump on a couple of centuries to 258 AD, and then we've got a Roman emperor. I'm going to try and find him for you, called Valerian. Have you heard of him?
Yep.
Emperor Valerian. Well, he's elected emperor in 253. And then he goes off, he buggers off to ancient Persia, and he fights against the Sasanians in 254 BC. And he leaves his son in charge, who's called Gallienus. So he's like acting Caesar in Rome while the Emperor Valerian is off fighting a war. What happens then is he gives instructions to his son to gather together all the Christians and to kill them all. It's one of the first of the persecutions of the Christians. Now, eventually Valerian is captured by a king of the Sasanians called Shapur the Great, and he's tortured to death in 260 AD. So that's the end of him. Nasty piece of work. But his son goes and does his duty to his father's instructions and gathers together. He gets the Pope. He captures the Pope who's giving a mass down in the catacombs, and this Pope is called Pope Sixtus II, and he gets executed by having his head chopped off. But before he dies, he gives instructions to his deacon, who's in charge of the Vatican treasure, the early bishops of Rome's treasure, which includes the cup of Christ, the Holy Grail. And he tells him to get the hell out of Rome with the cup, get the cup out of there, so that Valerian's lot can't grab hold of it and take it. So it's such a precious object to the Christian church, early Christian church. So this deacon is called Saint Lawrence or Lorenzo. Okay, so all these things like Sir Lawrence Seaway and all that are all named after him. And he manages to get the cup to a knight called Procilias, who's a Spanish knight in the Roman army. Right. Because at this time, of course, Rome owns Iberia. It dominates Iberia. And so the cup is taken by Procilias to Spain. All right. A few days later, Saint Lawrence, as he becomes a saint later, Lawrence the deacon, is arrested by Valerian's mob, and he's burnt alive, roasted alive on a gridiron. Now, this is, don't laugh at this. Don't want you to laugh at this. Right?
It's too late.
His dying words were, "Turn me over, I'm done on this side," and eat. Which is why he's the patron saint of comedians and chefs.
You're going to hell, David. I can't believe you said that.
No, I'm telling you, it's true. You ask any comedian or any chef who the patron saint of theirs, they'll say St. Lawrence.
Well, talk about gallows humour. Gosh.
Yeah, exactly. Wonderful story. Anyway, so he gets buried outside the walls of Rome. A very famous Catholic saint. But the cup then is carried to Huesca near to Zaragoza, up in Aragon, which is the home of St. Lawrence's family, Lorenzo's family. Right. And it stays in the farmhouse there for a few years before the cathedral at Huesca is constructed, and it's then placed inside the cathedral. But then, of course, what happens is the Moors invade Spain, and they threaten the Christians up in northeastern Spain. So they take this cup, and they hide it in a chapel in the Pyrenees, a little chapel by a stream, which I've been to see. You can hardly get there by car. It's very difficult. And then it gets moved to a college monastery where the kings of Aragon are raised and taught. And it's used there in the rituals there. And the Aragonese kings become the keepers of the Grail, the Holy Grail, the red cup. I didn't mention the fact it was red, did I? It's actually red agate, this cup. Okay. And it was made in the 1st century AD. The style of it is 1st century AD. And it was either made in Damascus or Tarsus or somewhere like that, possibly Alexandria. But it's from that period. Okay. So it fits in with the story of the Last Supper. And it would be something that Judge Arimathea would have purchased from somewhere. So the Grail is hidden away from the Moors, who don't eventually manage to capture the kingdom of Aragon, so that it remains a Visigoth center, Christian center. And these kings of Aragon are the keepers of the Grail, the most famous of which is called Alfonso el Batallador, or Alfonso I. Alfonso the Battler is his name in Spanish. And he is actually he is made the Holy Emperor of Spain by the Holy Roman Emperor. So, and the popes. So he becomes the big wig in the Christian world in northern Spain. And he fights against the Moors, etc. He actually fought with El Cid when they captured Valencia, when El Cid captured Valencia. So he's a historical figure, very famous figure in Spain. And he kept this cup in a monastery, a fortified monastery, in this part of the Pyrenees, the foothills of the Pyrenees, called San Juan de la Peña, or Saint John of the Crag. And the Grail was kept there for quite a few centuries after Alfonso died. This is where we get in, finally, to the story of Percival and Arthur.
Wow,
yeah?
Right.
Yes. So we forget Arthur. He's got nothing to do with it, quite frankly. But Percival does. And the story of Percival being of the court of King Arthur is woven into that legend, that British legend. But he's the one that's sent on the mission to find the Holy Grail, isn't he?
Yes.
Sir Percival. Mm. So now we get to the famous troubadours who wrote the stories of the Holy Grail and the quest for it, which were Chretien de Troyes, Chretien of what we would call Troy today, in the area of Champagne, eastern France, and Wolfram von Eschenbach, who is the great German knight who wrote the story of Parsifal, a few years after Chretien. So those two are the main writers who tell the story. We'll follow Parsifal in the German tradition, because that's the one that gives us all the clues. And so Percival, or Parsifal, turns up at a place called Bars. Okay, now Bars is Spanish Barca, which is Barcelona. Okay, so that's where he ends up on his quest, and then he goes along the Ebro Valley. So if you read Parsifal, you'll see it's called Ebro Bars, which means the combination of the river Ebro and Barcelona. So he travels up northwest, past Saragossa, and he arrives at a place where the instructions of a monk who was giving the instructions in the first place, when he was visiting a chapel in the mountains, which is the chapel that I told you about earlier on, where the Holy Grail was kept for a while. And he asked the monk who's in that chapel, where could he find a place for the night where he could stay, because he's on this quest for the Grail. And the monk tells him that he is the brother of the Grail keeper, the keeper of the Grail, the Fisher King. Okay, so remember that, because when we come to all this story, we'll find out who this brother was. So he gets this instruction to go along the Ebro Valley, and he says, turn right at the Great Rock. Okay, so I've been on this route and I can see exactly where it is. There's a huge rock sticking up out of the valley, and next to it there's a river valley, and you follow it due north, and you arrive at a place called Mont Salvation. Mont Salvation in Spanish, Salvacion, okay, which is Montsalvash in the German version, Wolfram's version of the place where the Holy Grail Castle is located. Montsalvash is Mont Salvacion in Spanish, okay? And then he turns up at this castle that nobody can find if they try to find it. They only ever find it by accident. And that is San Juan de la Peña, because if you go to San Juan de la Peña, you cannot see it until you arrive within 50 feet of it. It is hidden in a gorge beneath a cliff where the actual fortified monastery is built into the cliff. It's actually overhangs by the cliff, and you can't see it. And it's right next to a mountain called Mont Salvacion. Okay. Wow. So San Juan de la Peña is the Grail Castle, and the king he comes to meet, the Fisher King, is Alfonso I of Aragon, whose Latin name is Anfortas. And Anfortas is the name of the Grail King. Why is he called the Fisher King? Because Alfonso, he attacked a city on the coast of Spain, and he besieged it for a while. And just to upset the people inside the city, he used to go fishing outside the city in the sea. So he became known as the Fisher King. Okay, so Alfonso el Batallador, the great fighter against the Moors, is Anfortas Rex, who is the Grail King of the legend. So this cup, this red cup, has now turned up in San Juan de la Peña, where it stays for centuries. Eventually, there's a fire in the monastery, and the cup is handed over to what then were the Dukes of Barcelona. And the Dukes of Barcelona then become kings later on. Now, what happens to Alfonso is that he dies with a wound that's caused at the Battle of Fraga in his groin with a spear. And that is the story again of Anfortas, who cannot die. When Parsifal comes to the secret Grail castle, the wounded king is unable to die because he has a wound in the groin. Okay, so again, it ties in with the historical figure. But of course, the Grail King in the legend is relieved of the inability to die when Parsifal takes over the job of looking after the Grail. Okay, but in the Alfonso story, he then dies, and he's succeeded by his brother, who is a monk. He's the only one of the family left who can become the king. So the brother who told Parsifal in the chapel in the Pyrenees to go and seek out his brother, the king, the Fisher King, is actually Pedro el Monje, the monk, who becomes the successor of Alfonso I of Aragon. So again, the story ties through beautifully. So we now end up with this cup of Christ, which is now embellished with a chalice of gold and pearls, etc., and with a base of red agate, which is an upturned dish. So the cup is mounted on the top. Then you have a golden Byzantine metalwork with pearls and semi-precious stones. And then the base is an upturned dish made also of red agate. Okay?
Oh,
and this then
two grails for the price of one. Is that where we get the dish and the cup from then?
You're getting much more than that. Because scratched on it, on the base, very difficult to see, but you can scratch it, is an Arabic inscription calling it the Philosopher's Stone. So it's actually, and then you find that in various traditions of the legend of the Holy Grail, it is sometimes called the Philosopher's Stone.
Arabic?
Okay.
Why is it inscribed in Arabic?
Because when it was put together, the chalice was put together with the cup and the gold, they acquired from a Muslim who was ruling in Andalusia this Philosopher's Stone agate dish, which they then mounted into the chalice.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
Got you.
All right. So we're nearly at the end of this. I'm sure we're about 4 hours into this now. But anyway, so it's now in the hands of the kings of Barcelona. And that's in that place that you went to see, the Barcelona Palace, where the kings were. It was kept there for a while. Oh. And eventually, a few hundred years later, it was actually sold to Valencia. And it ended up in Valencia Cathedral, where it is today. Oh. You can actually go and see it behind the altar in the Grail Chapel, in what they call the Chapel of the Santo Calice, the Sacred Chalice or the Holy Chalice. And it's been in there for several hundred years. Napoleon tried to get hold of it, and they took it off to Mallorca while Napoleon was ruling because they didn't want him to grab hold of it. No, because it's always a power symbol. It's always been a power symbol, this thing.
Yeah, all the relics have been, haven't they?
Yeah, and then the Nazis tried to get hold of it. Himmler was looking for it in Spain, and so they hid it under the floorboards of a farmhouse quite near to Barcelona by two people who looked after it. And then it was brought back to the cathedral, and every year it's taken out and processed around the square in Valencia. One year, dozens of years ago now, probably about 40, 50 years ago, they gave the privilege of carrying the chalice to an old canon from the cathedral. And he tripped and fell and dropped it.
No.
And he smashed it to smithereens. And he was so petrified and freaked out by it that he had a heart attack and died on the spot.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
So they glued it all back together.
Oh.
And it's now sitting behind the altar in the Grail Chapel. And you can go and see it. Anybody can go and see it in Valencia. And not this current Pope, Francis, but the previous two, John Paul II and Ratzinger, Benedict, the first thing they did when they became Pope was to come to Valencia and perform the Mass with this chalice, with the cup of Christ.
They know, don't they?
Exactly. That's what I was about to say. They know damn well that it's the real thing. Okay. So that's my story. Okay. Now you can ask me questions. You should have been asking me questions all along, but anyway.
I just like listening. I like listening to all the history. I thought we might be heading to Valencia. And of all the
candidates,
yep, it seems to make sense. The sort of the scholars in ancient pottery have dated it, looking at it and analysing the shape and the volume and the way it's made. They say it fits. It's first century AD.
Correct.
And I think I read somewhere. Is it not related to some sort of ceremonial cup that was used in Passovers?
In Passovers?
A Jewish.
Yeah. Well, the only way that would be is if Joseph Arimathea, who was a Jew, and he was in the Sanhedrin, before Christianity used it for that purpose. That's entirely possible. But don't forget what I said at the very beginning. This was a Passover feast. The Last Supper was a Passover feast. Yep. So it's logical for that cup to be brought out for him to use. But at that moment, when we have the Eucharist, we turn from Judaism to Christianity. That's the transitional moment in time when he says, this is my body, this is my blood. And that symbol of that cup is the key, really, to the power of the Christian church all the way through this era, because it was such an important relic, perhaps the greatest of all the relics, I would guess.
Yeah, I think it strengthens its case that it if it bears similarities to a contemporary vessel that was used in Jewish Passover ceremonies prior to that, it strengthens the case for me.
Yeah, and once you know there are two Shabbats, there's Sabbaths. There's the high Sabbath of the Passover, and then 2 days later there's the Friday Shabbat, which is the weekly Sabbath. That explains everything about why there's a plural of Sabbaths in the texts, in the Gospels, in one Gospel anyway, and the fact that there's a 3-day gap between the burial of Jesus and the so-called empty tomb. So that all fits much better once you realize there's a Passover Shabbat and there's the weekly Shabbat following up on afterwards.
Just going to
that only happens in 26 AD or 28 AD. Sorry.
Yeah,
AD.
So it fits. Going back to the 3 days and the resurrection, a lot of people point this towards the winter solstice, and they think of Jesus as like a sun day. They compare him with earlier sun deities, and that the sun is seen to, on the shortest day of the year, sort of hangs in the sky for 3 days, and then the sun is reborn, if you like. What do you think is going on there? Is this like a later Romanization?
No, have you got another hour?
I know.
No, okay. Let me just tell you quickly. If the crucifixion took place on the Mount of Olives, near the summit of the Mount of Olives, incidentally, where there is a tomb from this period with a big stone that's been rolled to one side, just a few hundred feet away up there, okay, it looks down on the axis of the temple of Herod that previously was the temple of Solomon. It looks right down onto the facade of the temple, because the facade of the temple faces east for the sunrise, because in Yahwism, or the symbolism, we have this solar cult, or this solar ideology, which we see in the Psalms of David, where God is the light of the sun, is the light, okay? And so that idea is the orientation of the temple is such that theologically, the sunrise will light the Holy of Holies where the Ark of the Covenant is located, theologically. Okay, so when Jesus is executed on the cross, the moment he dies, the temple curtain, which there are two of them. There's one in the Holy of Holies, and there's a big one that hangs on the outside the facade of the temple. From the position of the crucifixion, the Roman soldiers can see that this great big curtain is torn asunder. It's ripped in two at the moment of Jesus' death. Now that's mentioned there, which is more evidence that the only place the crucifixion could have taken place is on the Mount of Olives to the east of the temple where the sun rises. So you have a connection. And it's also, by the way, the place where the so-called ascension takes place. The place of the so-called ascension to heaven is on that Mount of Olives too, in the same location. So everything is worked out to fit with the theology of Yahwism and the solar cult.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
In fact, there was a chariot of the sun in the temple forecourt of the Jewish temple, which was associated with Yahwism, with Yahweh.
Wow. This is absolutely fascinating, David. I wish we could have you every week.
Yeah.
Oh, no, not at my age. You can't. No, sorry.
But I
You'll
realise
have to come back in. We'll have to come back in another couple of years then. How about that?
Because I realise you're an hour ahead of us and time's knocking on, and I don't want to keep you up longer than we.
Well, I'm more worried about you. You've got all your other stuff to do after this, haven't you?
I know.
Going to do.
Yeah. We'll manage.
Well, I thought I was. Go on. Sorry.
I was gonna wrap up, to be honest with you, and ask you if there's anything you want to leave us with, anything you've got coming up you want to tell us about, or.
Well, not really. I've got books to write and I've stuff coming out, and I just thought I did a bit better this time because I wasn't rushing like the clappers. The last one we did together, I was running so fast it was hardly worth listening to me. This time I hope I've been a bit slower and you've managed to absorb it, but it's been complicated, hasn't it? There's a lot of stuff to go through, and I've missed out loads.
Yeah.
But there you go. But it's a story that's worth pursuing if you want to research it. You're into this sort of thing. I doubt if I'm ever going to write a book about it. I don't think I've got it in me.
Have you not touched on the Holy Grail on any of your previous books?
No.
Oh, really?
No. I'm not a New Testament scholar or early Christian scholar. I'm a Old Testament, late Bronze Age Egyptologist, dirt archaeologist. Yeah. So it's not something I've been trained into, but I've been trained into how to get the interdisciplinary material together to construct a storyline or a history. And I think, I tell you what, it would make a great movie, wouldn't it? Or a TV series.
It would, wouldn't it?
You could have a 3-part TV series about the early part in Israel, Judea, then the British part, then the Roman part, then the Spanish part. Yeah. 4-part series.
Anyone?
That would be good fun.
GoFundMe? Someone's saying GoFundMe in my ear. I think we should set this up.
You need to get your linen suit pressed.
Head of cinematography, Amish Phil.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
I'll do sound.
Tell you what, all three of us could come and do it, can't we? Together, we could be we could be the knights of the square table. All right, in search of the Holy Grail.
Excellent.
So there you go. You'll have to get Ben back, because that would make one for each side of the table then, if you could do that.
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
I'm sure he would come back for that.
He would.
So anyway, have you enjoyed it?
Absolutely.
It was good. Yeah. I've learned loads from that.
And,
it might not be true. People can criticize it, but I think it holds together quite well.
Well, just looking at the comments we've had on the live stream, people are pretty blown away. Kellyanna says, "Thank you so much, David. Absolutely amazing. Absolutely fascinating. Whoa! Great guest. Amazing." So it's been great. Thanks for joining us again. We shall sign off. We'll sign off for this part, and we'll see you lot in podcast land for part 2. David, stay on the line for us just for 1 minute while we play ourselves out.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for your time.
Yeah.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.